It was 4:17 a.m. when the world stopped making sense. In the sleepy valley nestled between jagged mountains, the night was still. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the soft hum of the few homes that dotted the landscape. The streets were empty, the shops closed, and most people were in the deep, peaceful embrace of sleep. Then, without warning, it began. A low, gut-wrenching tremor, so deep it felt as though the earth itself was groaning. It started beneath their feet, undetectable at first, a subtle quiver in the ground, as though something beneath the surface was waking up. The few who were awake thought it might have been a gust of wind or the faint rumble of a distant truck. But it wasn't. A violent roar split the silence, as if the earth had suddenly decided it could no longer bear its own weight. The ground twisted, buckled, and splintered. The air was thick with dust and fear. Buildings groaned under the pressure, their foundations cracking like dry wood. And then the roar grew louder. It wasn't just the sound of an earthquake. No, it was something much worse. A deafening, violent roar that seemed to come from deep inside the planet, as if the earth itself was screaming. And with it, the earth buckled. The road that ran through the valley twisted violently like a piece of paper folded by an unseen hand. In a matter of seconds, buildings that had stood for decades were reduced to rubble. Bridges, once sturdy and reliable, folded in on themselves, their steel frames bending like soft metal. The structures meant to protect people became the very tools of their destruction. Inside the homes, families awoke to the horrifying sounds of the earth tearing apart. Screams pierced the night as walls collapsed, roofs caved in, and windows shattered, sending glass shards like daggers into the darkness. The roar continued, overwhelming all other sound. It drowned out the screams of those who had been caught in the chaos, the cries of families calling out for their loved ones. For a moment, it felt as if the world was dying. In one of the shattered homes, Sarah awoke just as the walls around her cracked. Her first instinct was to shield her young daughter, Emma. But before she could act, the roof came down, sending a cascade of debris down upon them. The house that had once felt so warm and safe was now a tomb, its bones twisted and crushed under the weight of the earth's fury. Outside, it wasn't much better. Cars were overturned, roads split open as though the earth itself was swallowing them whole. The sound of buildings collapsing was joined by the screech of metal against concrete, the roar of destruction too overwhelming to ignore. The valley, once a peaceful haven, was now an inferno of dust, rock, and shattered glass. And still, the roar didn't stop. Minutes felt like hours. The shaking seemed to go on forever, relentless in its intensity. Some people never even had the chance to flee. Their homes were consumed by the earth's wrath before they could even stand. Others tried, but the roads were impassable. The streets buckled into jagged crevices. Escape was impossible. When the shaking finally stopped, the silence that followed felt unnatural, an eerie calm after the storm. It was only then that the true scale of the disaster began to reveal itself. But even in those first minutes, no one knew just how bad it was. Sarah had managed to crawl from under the wreckage, blood dripping from her head, her hands shaking as she tried to free Emma from the debris. She couldn't hear the screams anymore, only the distant muffled sounds of people trying to help one another. But in the haze of confusion, everything seemed unreal, as if the world had fractured into 1,000 pieces, leaving only fragments of life behind. It wasn't until Sarah stumbled out onto the main road, her heart pounding with desperation, that she saw it. The entire town gone. The familiar landmarks were reduced to rubble. The old church, the park where she had taken Emma to play just days ago, everything was gone. The streets were unrecognizable, with massive cracks running through them like deep scars. The only thing that remained was the dust, thick and choking, clouding the air. She took one unsteady step after another, trying to call out, but her voice was lost in the wind. There were others, survivors like her, wandering in a haze, dazed and disoriented. Some were shouting for help, some were crying, clutching their loved ones in their arms. But there were also those who had nothing left. Families torn apart, homes turned to dust, futures erased in a single moment. A man stumbled past her, his face pale and wide-eyed, his mouth working in silent desperation. He pointed toward the horizon, but Sarah could barely comprehend what he was saying. "Help! No! They're still trapped!" Before Sarah could even respond, he turned and ran, his steps unsteady, lost in the vastness of the destruction. It was then that she realized no one was coming. Not yet. The roads were clogged with wreckage. Emergency services, if they existed, hadn't shown up. The only people moving through the streets were survivors like her. And as the minutes dragged into hours, it became clear. The system that was supposed to protect them, whatever it was nowhere to be seen. And then, just as Sarah was about to collapse from the weight of her own disbelief, she heard the sound of a siren. But it wasn't an ambulance. It was the sound of a government vehicle, the unmistakable hum of an official convoy. At the time, Sarah didn't think much of it, but later, when everything began to fall into place, she would realize that the presence of the authorities wasn't to rescue anyone. It was to control the situation. The tremors had stopped, but the world still felt wrong. The air was thick with dust, and a sickly quiet had settled over the valley. As the survivors emerged from the wreckage of their homes, the weight of what had just happened began to settle in. The sound of cries, once loud and raw, now echoed faintly, as if even the earth itself was reluctant to speak. Sarah stood in the middle of what used to be her street, staring at the ruins where her home had once stood. She couldn't process it all. Too much destruction, too many lives lost in a matter of seconds. She could hear the distant wail of sirens, but none of the vehicles she had expected to see. The ambulances, fire trucks, or paramedics had arrived. Instead, black SUVs began to appear, speeding into the valley with an authority that seemed to command the very air. They were government vehicles, marked with the insignia of local officials. Some of them were hastily pulling up to the center of the destroyed town, where a group of survivors had gathered, bewildered and scared. But these weren't the kind of people who ran toward the smoke to help. These were the kind of people who stayed in the shadows, carefully watching. And when Sarah caught sight of the man who stepped out of the first car, her stomach twisted. Mayor Adrian Sharp, the mayor who had made empty promises for years, always promising the valley would be safe, if only they could make a few more cuts to the budget, now stood tall among the wreckage, scanning the scene as if the devastation were a minor inconvenience. He wasn't rushing to help anyone. His gaze swept over the survivors, the grieving families, and the fallen buildings, but his expression remained impassive, like a man who had seen it all before. Sarah's pulse quickened. There was something wrong. She wasn't the only one who felt it. As more government officials arrived, they didn't seem to be organizing search and rescue teams. Instead, they began to set up perimeters, marking off sections of the valley with bright red tape. Some survivors tried to approach them, asking for help or searching for family members. But each time, the officials turned them away with curt nods, their expressions cold and unyielding. Sarah could hear bits and pieces of the conversation as she approached one of the officials, a tall woman with a stern face. "No one is to speak to the media," the woman was saying into a phone, her voice low and controlled. "Tell them the casualty count is low. Keep it to a minimum. We don't need this getting out of hand. The public mustn't panic." Her words struck Sarah like a slap. "Casualty count is low?" Sarah muttered to herself. She felt a pit form in her stomach. There was no way the number of victims could be low. She had seen what had happened. The entire town had been torn apart. People were dead. Thousands were still trapped. This was no minor incident. It was a catastrophe, a disaster of unimaginable scale. But that was exactly the point. The officials weren't here to help. They were here to control the story. In the hours that followed, the survivors began to realize the true nature of the authorities' actions. Local hospitals were told to only treat a select few, the most visible injuries, while the majority of the wounded were left untreated. Those who had been rescued from the rubble but were too severely injured to move were simply ignored, as if they didn't exist. And then the rumors began to spread. Whispers in the crowd hinted that the mayor's office had already begun sending out orders to keep the disaster scope contained. Eyewitnesses who had filmed the chaos on their phones found their footage deleted by local officials. Reporters who arrived to cover the destruction were stopped at roadblocks and told to leave. their press passes nullified. Anyone who tried to take pictures or videos of the ruins found themselves confronted by stern-faced men in dark suits, warning them that the area was restricted and no information was to leave the site. Sarah had tried to speak to a few of the officials, asking about her daughter Emma, who she hadn't been able to find in the chaos. But each time she asked for help, she was met with cold indifference. The officials didn't offer condolences, they only offered one thing: silence. "Your family members will be added to the list later," one official had told her, barely meeting her eyes. "The list?" she'd asked. "The casualty list," the official had replied curtly. But when Sarah asked when the list would be available, the man just shook his head. "Later, once everything settles, we have bigger things to worry about right now." It wasn't long before the frustration of the survivors turned into anger. People began shouting at the officials, demanding answers, asking where the rescue teams were, where their loved ones were. But every demand was met with the same cold response. "You need to stay calm," they were told. "The situation is under control." But it wasn't under control, and everyone knew it. That night, as Sarah wandered through the wreckage, she came across a few others who had been looking for their families. Among them was a woman named Carla, holding a flashlight and searching the rubble near what used to be a hospital. "My husband was in there," Carla explained through tears. "He was scheduled for surgery. He's still in there somewhere. I know it." Sarah's heart sank, but she could offer no comfort. She couldn't even tell her own daughter's whereabouts, let alone help anyone else find their loved ones. "There's nothing left of the hospital," Sarah said softly, "but I promise you, we're going to find them. We need to keep looking." As the night wore on, the survivors slowly began to lose hope. The reality of the situation began to sink in. They were alone, abandoned. The following morning, when Sarah returned to what was left of her house, she was approached by a young man, his eyes wild and filled with desperation. He was a journalist, she realized as he held out his press pass. "Please," or he begged, "I need to talk to someone who saw everything. The officials are keeping everything locked down. They're controlling the narrative. I can't get any of this information out." Sarah's eyes widened. The truth was already being buried. "What do you need?" she asked quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "I need your story," the journalist said. "Everything you saw, the real numbers, the real damage. I'm trying to get the word out before they erase it all, before they tell the world it wasn't as bad as it really was." She hesitated, but only for a moment. The world needed to know what had really happened here. She had to make sure it wasn't forgotten. "I'll help," she said, her voice firm. And so as the dust settled and the silence stretched into the horizon, the story began to unfold, one that no one was supposed to hear. The morning sun did little to warm the devastation that had unfolded in the valley. Its light filtered weakly through the dust, casting long shadows over the broken landscape. Where there had once been life, there was now only a hollow quiet, a city torn apart, a world turned upside down. Sarah stood by the remnants of her home, staring at the still smoking ruins. She had spent hours searching for any trace of Emma, anything, but all she found were pieces of the life they had shared, scattered in the rubble. A shoe, a photograph, a broken necklace. Nothing that told her where her daughter might be. A sound broke through the haze of her thoughts, the unmistakable roar of official vehicles returning. More black SUVs, more figures in dark suits arrived in the valley. They moved with a precision that felt too practiced, too coordinated. It was as if they had expected this chaos, as though this wasn't an unprecedented disaster, but rather a situation to be managed. The men and women in suits moved through the crowds of survivors, their presence suffocating. They were not offering help, they were issuing orders. Sarah watched from a distance as Mayor Adrian Sharp, flanked by his entourage, stepped onto a makeshift stage set up at the center of the town. The crowd was growing, survivors and reporters alike, all desperate for information. But when the mayor opened his mouth, it was clear they would get nothing. "People of the valley," Mayor Sharp began, his voice booming through a microphone, "I know this has been a devastating event for all of us, but I assure you, the situation is under control. The loss of life is tragic, but it is much less than what we had feared. Our priority now is to rebuild and restore order. Sarah's fist clenched at his words. Much less than what we had feared? She wanted to shout that he was lying, that thousands were gone, buried under the rubble. But she couldn't. She had seen firsthand how these officials operated. They were spinning a story, crafting a narrative for the public that would absolve them of any responsibility. The mayor's press conference continued, though the words that followed felt hollow, scripted. He talked about recovery efforts, temporary shelters, and the need to remain calm. But there was no mention of the true scale of the disaster. No mention of the people still trapped beneath the rubble. No mention of the families still unaccounted for. When he finished, the crowd erupted in murmurs of disbelief and frustration. A few survivors began shouting questions, demanding to know why the rescue efforts were so disorganized, why no one had been allowed to help in the first few hours. But the officials around the mayor quickly formed a barrier, ushering him back into his vehicle with practiced speed, blocking the way of anyone who tried to ask anything more. Sarah's eyes followed the group, her heart pounding with a mixture of rage and fear. She couldn't believe what she had just witnessed. The mayor, the very man who had been warned about the unstable conditions of the valley, was now standing in front of a crowd telling them everything was under control. No mention of the infrastructure issues that had been ignored for years. No mention of the reports that had been falsified. The truth was disappearing before her eyes. Later that evening, Sarah found herself back in the remains of what had been the local cafe, a small, quiet place she and Emma had visited often. It was a strange thing to see it like this, its windows shattered, its walls cracked and crumbling. Yet even here, she found the same things she'd seen all around the valley. Survivors, frustrated and searching for answers, but silenced by the weight of an invisible force. The journalist she had spoken to earlier, the one who had asked her for her story, was there. His name was Daniel, and he was hunched over a table, scribbling in a notepad. His eyes darted from side to side, constantly scanning the room. He looked like a man on the edge of a breaking point, exhausted but determined. Sarah approached him cautiously, her heart racing. "Daniel," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Have you found anything?" He looked up, his eyes tired but sharp. "Not much. They've locked everything down. The roads, the hospitals, even the morgue. No one's talking. But I've been hearing things." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There's a cover-up. The casualty numbers are being manipulated, altered. And it's not just here, it's everywhere." Sarah's stomach twisted. "I knew it," she said quietly. "I knew they were hiding the truth. They've been doing it since the moment the earthquake hit. They're trying to downplay the whole thing, like it was no big deal." Daniel nodded. "Exactly. They're controlling the narrative. The rescue teams that should have been here hours ago, they're nowhere to be seen. And anyone who speaks out, anyone who dares to tell the real story, is being silenced or disappeared." "Silenced?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "What do you mean silenced?" "They're deleting footage, confiscating phones, and giving orders to stop anyone from reporting what really happened," Daniel said, his voice grim. "I've already had 2 calls from reporters saying their stories got pulled before they could even go live. It's like a blackout. No one wants the public to know how bad this really is." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She had to do something. She had to make sure that people knew what had really happened, that the truth didn't get buried along with the thousands who had died. "You're not alone in this," she said, her voice suddenly steady. "I'll help you. I have photos, interviews, anything I can find. I'll get it to you. We'll make sure the world knows the truth." Daniel looked at her, surprised by her resolve. "Are you sure? It's dangerous. They're watching everyone. But if you're in, we can do something. We can't let them erase this." "I'm in," Sarah said, her voice firm. "We have to fight back. We can't let them get away with it." As the night drew on, Sarah and Daniel began to gather the pieces of the truth, photos, testimonies, and fragments of evidence. Every time they thought they had something concrete, they felt the weight of the officials' presence closing in around them. The government's machinery was moving fast, suppressing anything and everything that threatened to expose the truth. But Sarah wasn't about to back down. The truth she knew was too important, and someone had to make sure the world heard it, even if it meant risking everything. The days after the disaster bled into each other, marked only by the ceaseless efforts to rebuild. and the quiet, ever-present oppression of the truth. Every time Sarah turned around, it felt like the world was conspiring to bury what had happened. The official casualty numbers, constantly updated, were always too low, too controlled. The media outlets, carefully orchestrated by the authorities, continued to push the narrative that the disaster had been tragic but manageable. But every survivor knew the truth. The valley was gone. People were still trapped. There were bodies under the rubble, and yet the world was being told it wasn't as bad as it seemed. Sarah could feel the walls closing in on her. She had managed to keep her meetings with Daniel under wraps, using old back alleys, quiet corners, and forgotten buildings. But the authorities were tightening their grip. Local checkpoints, manned by soldiers in dark uniforms, had appeared on every road leading into and out of the valley. Anyone who tried to leave or enter without proper identification or authorization was turned away or detained for questioning. Every night, the air seemed to grow colder, heavier, as the officials consolidated power over the narrative. Sarah's hope, once a bright flicker of rebellion, now felt fragile. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't let the truth die in the dark. One afternoon, as Sarah was returning from a trip to one of the few remaining standing structures, a makeshift medical center for the wounded, she was stopped by an unfamiliar man. He was dressed in a plain black jacket, his face hidden beneath a hood, but something about him felt out of place, a kind of quiet authority that Sarah immediately recognized as dangerous. "Sarah," he said in a low voice, stepping into her path, "I need to speak with you." Her heart skipped a beat. She had never seen him before, but the way he said her name sent a chill down her spine. "I don't know you," Sarah said, taking a cautious step back. "What do you want?" "I'm not here to hurt you," the man said, his tone calm but firm. "But you need to listen. The story you're trying to expose. It's not just about your town. This goes much higher. You're digging in places you're not meant to be." Sarah's pulse raced. "Who are you?" He pulled back his hood slightly, revealing a sharp jawline and piercing eyes that seemed to bore into her soul. "My name is Lucas. I'm with the Department of Civil Affairs. We've been watching you. We know you've been speaking to the press, trying to spread the real numbers." Sarah's breath caught. Civil Affairs. Was he government? An agent sent to shut her down? But Lucas didn't seem like the typical government official. There was no arrogance in his gaze, no hidden malice. He didn't look like the others who had been trying to silence the truth. Instead, his expression was tense, worried even. "I'm not your enemy," he continued, lowering his voice. "But if you continue down this path, you're going to be buried with it. The authorities have already begun erasing the real records. The true death toll, the real number of people lost, it's being hidden. The bodies, they're being moved. And anyone who tries to dig deeper, they disappear." A cold dread swept through Sarah. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying they're cleaning up the disaster," Lucas replied, glancing around as if making sure no one else was listening. "The media is controlled. The rescue teams are instructed to pick and choose who they save. The rest, well, the rest are left to be forgotten." "Who's behind this?" Sarah asked, her voice a whisper. "Who's ordering this?" Lucas didn't answer immediately. He hesitated, his eyes flicking to the soldiers patrolling the area. Then with a sigh, he stepped closer. "It's the local government, but there's more. The funding for emergency services, for rescue teams, was misallocated. The mayor's sharp. He's covering up not just the numbers, but the negligence. Engineers had been warning him for years about the stability of this region. The whole valley was a disaster waiting to happen, but he ignored it. He chose profit over safety." Sarah's chest tightened. "How do you know all of this?" "I've been working undercover. I was supposed to make sure the evacuation efforts went smoothly, but I found the discrepancies, the lies. When the earthquake hit, I tried to help, tried to get to the people who needed it most, but the higher-ups stopped me. And then I saw how deep it went. I saw the bodies being moved. I saw the classified reports, the ones that show the real numbers." Lucas reached into his coat and pulled out a small folder, its edges worn. He handed it to Sarah with a warning look in his eyes. "This is everything you need to know. The true extent of the disaster, the real death toll, the names of the officials who covered it up." Sarah took the folder, her hands shaking. It felt heavy, not just with paper, but with the weight of everything that had been hidden. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Lucas sighed again, his face darkening. "Because someone has to. Someone has to expose what happened here. And I don't want to be the one who stood by and watched it all burn. But if you go public with this, if you make it known, you'll be targeted. You'll be silenced. Be careful. I'm not the only one who's trying to make sure this story stays buried." He turned and began to walk away, but Sarah's voice stopped him. "Where will you go?" He paused but didn't turn back. "You'll never see me again, but I'll be watching, and I'll make sure the truth stays in your hands." With that, he disappeared into the crowd, leaving Sarah alone with the folder that now contained everything she needed to expose the truth. That night, Sarah and Daniel met in the same place they always did, hidden in the back of a gutted warehouse that had once been a storage facility for old farming equipment. As Sarah handed him the folder, his eyes widened. "This is it," Daniel whispered, barely able to breathe. "This is everything. This proves it all." She nodded, her stomach churning. The weight of the information inside the folder felt unbearable. But this was the moment. This was when the truth would finally come to light. Daniel looked up from the folder, his face grave. "We can't waste any time. We need to get this out, now." Sarah swallowed hard. "The authorities are watching everything. We can't risk it. Not yet." "We don't have a choice," Daniel urged. "If we wait too long, it'll be too late. The officials will burn everything. They'll erase everything." "I know," Sarah whispered, her hands trembling. "But we need to be careful. If we make the wrong move, we'll never get the truth out. We need to be smarter." They both knew what had to be done. They couldn't just go to the media. They couldn't go public with something so dangerous yet. The authorities were too powerful, too well connected. They had to be patient, strategic, and they had to find a way to expose the truth without getting caught. For now, they had only one option left. They had to find allies, people who were willing to risk everything for the truth. And that search would take them deeper into the heart of the conspiracy, to places neither of them could have imagined. The folder felt heavy in Sarah's hands, but the weight of its contents was nothing compared to the burden that had now settled on her shoulders. The truth she'd uncovered was not just a matter of lost lives. It was a systemic failure of an unimaginable scale. She wasn't just fighting for her daughter anymore. She was fighting for thousands of lives that had been erased, buried by a network of people determined to silence the disaster. She sat at the worn table in their makeshift headquarters, the flickering light from a single dim bulb casting long shadows on the walls. Daniel leaned over the folder, his fingers trembling slightly as he flipped through the documents inside. The truth was so much worse than he had imagined. "These reports," Daniel murmured, his voice low, "they're not just about the infrastructure failures. This goes higher than the mayor. These are national documents. The funding, the allocations for the rescue teams, they were siphoned off. This wasn't just negligence. It was a deliberate, coordinated effort." Sarah's breath caught. "You're saying this was planned?" "I'm not saying it was planned, but it was certainly allowed to happen," Daniel replied, his face pale. "These reports show clear signs of corruption. The engineers' warnings weren't just ignored, they were buried. These people were fully aware of the risks, but they chose profit over safety. They didn't just ignore the warnings, they hid them. And now they're covering their tracks by rewriting the story of what happened here." The more they read, the darker the picture became. The paperwork in the folder was riddled with redactions, names blacked out, entire sections of reports removed as though they were never meant to see the light of day. But even through the heavy censorship, one thing was clear: the disaster had been avoidable. Entire sectors of the population had been left exposed to an impending catastrophe because those in charge had prioritized anything but their safety. Sarah felt a cold rage begin to rise inside her. She had seen what the earthquake had done to the valley. Lives shattered, families lost, everything reduced to dust. But this was a deliberate betrayal. They had known the region was unstable. They had known the infrastructure was inadequate, and they had allowed it all to fail. "The mayor," Sarah began, her voice hard with determination. "He wasn't just complicit in all this. He orchestrated it. Sharp's been hiding the truth from the very beginning." Daniel nodded grimly. "It's not just Sharp. He's a puppet. There are bigger forces at play here. The higher-ups in the government, people tied to the national infrastructure projects, they're the ones pulling the strings. Sarah's mind raced. We need to get this out there now. The world has to know what happened here. Daniel's expression darkened. If we go public with this, they'll shut us down before we even get a chance to speak. They've already erased the initial reports. They're controlling the narrative, and they're watching everyone. Sarah clenched her fists. Then we need to find a way to go underground. We need to get this to someone who can make it public, someone who can't be silenced. She knew what that meant. They had to find an ally in the media who could be trusted with the truth. Someone who had the reach, the influence, and the courage to defy the government's pressure. Over the next few days, Sarah and Daniel worked quickly. They spent every waking hour going through the documents, cross-referencing them with the testimonies of survivors they had collected, trying to piece together the full picture. They knew they couldn't go to the major outlets, not with the government keeping a tight grip on all media channels, but there had to be someone who could help them get the story out. Then they found their lead. Her name was Elena Fisher. She was an independent investigative journalist known for taking on powerful corporations and government agencies. Her reputation was built on exposing corruption, no matter how deep it ran. But she had gone underground after publishing a series of explosive reports about environmental violations committed by multinational companies. The government had silenced her for a time until she disappeared from the public eye, and her whereabouts became a mystery. But Sarah and Daniel had one advantage. They knew where to find her. The meeting place was set in the dead of night, in a small cafe on the outskirts of a neighboring town, far enough from the valley to avoid suspicion, but close enough to be accessible. They had no idea whether Elena would show, but Sarah knew that this was their only chance. She couldn't keep running forever. When they arrived, the cafe was empty, save for a few patrons nursing their drinks at the far end of the room. The atmosphere was dim and quiet, and every sound seemed to echo too loudly in the empty space. Sarah's heart pounded as she and Daniel took their seats, waiting. A few minutes later, the door opened. A woman entered, her features concealed beneath a dark scarf, her eyes scanning the room as she moved with quiet confidence. She didn't make a grand entrance, but there was something unmistakable about her presence. She wasn't just a journalist. She was someone who had lived through enough danger to know how to blend into the shadows. "Elena Fisher?" Daniel asked, standing as the woman approached. She nodded, removing her scarf, revealing short, dark hair and a set of sharp, calculating eyes that immediately assessed the situation. "I've read your work," Elena said, sitting down without waiting for an invitation. "I know what you're trying to do, and I'll tell you this right now. If you came here thinking I'd just throw this into a headline and let you walk away, you're wrong." Sarah felt her stomach twist. "We don't have time to be cautious anymore," she said, pushing the folder across the table. "We have everything you need to expose the truth, the full scale of the disaster, the corruption, the cover-up." Elena didn't immediately touch the folder. Instead, she studied Sarah carefully, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she opened the folder and began flipping through the documents. Her eyes narrowed as she read, absorbing the magnitude of what they had uncovered. The air between them grew heavy with tension, and for a moment, no one spoke. Finally, Elena looked up. "This is explosive. This isn't just a local story. This is national, international even, but it's also dangerous." She leaned back in her chair, the weight of her words hanging in the air. "You know what you're asking me to do? Exposing this isn't just about getting the truth out. It's about fighting a war, and people die in wars." Sarah's voice was steady but filled with resolve. "We don't have a choice. If we don't act now, the truth will be buried forever. Thousands of lives were lost. People are still missing. This is to be exposed." Elena stared at her for a long moment, her eyes piercing through the silence. Finally, she nodded. "All right, I'll help you. But I need to know everything. The full story. The names, the players, the evidence. This won't happen if any part of this story is left out." With that, they set to work, knowing that once they crossed this line, there would be no going back. The fight for the truth had begun, and there would be no turning back from what was to come. In the days that followed, Sarah, Daniel, and Elena worked tirelessly. They compiled evidence, wrote their reports, and meticulously gathered testimonies. Elena's network of trusted sources grew, and soon they had allies from all corners. Journalists, activists, even some former officials who had seen the corruption firsthand. The story, once locked away in the shadows, was starting to take shape. And as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Sarah began to realize that this wasn't just about exposing one disaster. It was about bringing down an entire system built on lies. The real fight was just beginning. It had been days since the final documents were sent to the United Nations. Days since Sarah, Daniel, and Elena had slipped into the shadows waiting for their moment. They knew the authorities were closing in. The government would stop at nothing to silence them, erasing the evidence, hiding the bodies, and rewriting the history of the disaster. But they couldn't let it happen. As the hours ticked away, the pressure mounted. The UN's deadline was drawing near, and their meeting with the international community was the only thing standing between the truth and total erasure. It was their last chance, one shot at exposing the full scale of the disaster, the corruption, and the people who had tried to bury it all. Sarah sat by the window in the safe house, staring out at the moonlit street. It was quiet, too quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. She could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her. The people they had fought for, the survivors, the families who had lost everything, they were counting on her. They were counting on all of them. Daniel entered the room, his eyes weary but resolute. "We're ready. We just need to make it to the meeting. Once the truth is out, there's no going back." Sarah nodded, standing up to meet him. "We've already made sure the evidence is there. The rest is up to the world now." Elena, who had been working in the corner, turned toward them. Her expression was hard, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. "They can't erase this, Sarah. We've made sure of that. The world knows it's too big to bury anymore." They had done everything they could. The evidence was undeniable. The report had gone global. The documents had reached the right hands, and the pressure from the international community had been relentless. Governments were now watching, waiting to see how the United Nations would respond. The story was out. People were demanding accountability, but the hardest part was yet to come. They were escorted into the room, an austere, cold space filled with the representatives of the world's most powerful nations. Their eyes were sharp, their voices hushed as they glanced over the documents presented by Sarah, Daniel, and Elena. The evidence had been carefully laid out: testimonies, photographs, reports, and undeniable proof of the disaster that had been hidden for so long. The room was silent for a moment, and Sarah could feel the weight of the world bearing down on them. This was the moment they had worked for, fought for, risked everything for. The moment when the truth would finally be heard. A delegate from a major country stood up, adjusting his glasses and looking around the room. "This evidence is overwhelming," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "If what you're saying is true, then we are looking at a systemic failure on an unimaginable scale. We cannot allow this to go unpunished." The tension in the room grew palpable as representatives from various nations began to murmur among themselves. The debate would be long, but it was happening. The truth had been laid bare, and the world could no longer ignore it. Sarah glanced at Daniel and Elena, her heart pounding. This was it. This was what they had fought for. But then, as the session continued, something happened. The door at the back of the room opened with a loud bang, and several military officials rushed in. Sarah's stomach dropped. "We have a problem," the official at the door said, his voice low but urgent. "The government's been staging a counter-operation. They've just claimed that all evidence was falsified. They're calling this a smear campaign against national security." The room erupted in chaos. "They're trying to silence us," Daniel whispered, his voice tight with fury. "They'll stop at nothing." But it was too late. Outside the UN building, the world was already reacting. News outlets worldwide were picking up the story, and protests erupted across the globe. People rallied behind the victims, demanding justice. The evidence was irrefutable. Even as the government fought to suppress it, the truth had already found its way into the hearts and minds of millions. But the fight was far from over. As the meeting inside grew more heated, Sarah knew that their work was far from complete. The government would try to bury the story, discredit the evidence, and twist the narrative. But they had made it too far for it to go unnoticed. The truth could no longer be contained. The world was speaking out. The survivors were speaking out. Sarah turned to Daniel and Elena, her eyes filled with determination. We did it. We brought the truth to the world. Now we fight for it. The days that followed were a blur of activity. The UN passed a resolution demanding an international investigation into the disaster, and sanctions were placed on the government responsible. The truth had officially broken through, and the global outcry continued to grow. But the government's retaliatory measures were swift. They moved quickly to discredit those who had spoken out, labeling them as radicals and traitors. The fight was far from over. Sarah, Daniel, and Elena had to keep moving, knowing that the forces they were up against would stop at nothing to silence them. But they had taken the first step. The truth was no longer something hidden in the dark. It was now part of the global conversation, and they had made sure that no one would forget. The road ahead would be dangerous. But Sarah knew one thing above all else. They had ignited something that could never be extinguished. The truth about the disaster that killed thousands and the cover-up that followed is still being fought for. The people who risked everything to expose it continue to face the threat of silencing. But now, with your voice and your support, we can make sure the truth reaches the world. Subscribe to Legacy Thread. Together we can ensure that the voices of the silenced are heard and the truth can never be buried again.